Recently, you've been hearing me talk about being on mission. And before we really launch into this, I want to say this. Great ways to be on mission as a church. Number one is to be here. This sermon series is intended to be something that will really help us define who God is in our life. But also, if you have friends that are seeking or questions or whatever, invite them to come and be with you, especially during this series, because we're going to talk about God, His character, His nature, who He is, what He means, and how He feels about us as His children and as individuals. So I hope you'll do that, man. Being on mission is, be here, invite your friends to be here, be a part of a group where you can do life together. It's important. You're going to find this God that we wish you knew in these groups. So I want to encourage you to do those things. Before we begin, a story. It's actually a joke. I heard it this week. I got to tell it. Moses, Jesus, and an old man are playing golf. You with me so far? They're at a par 3. It's a long par 3, and they all agree that they're going to try and drive the green on the first shot. They take their 2-irons out of their bags, and if you play golf, you know it's almost impossible to hit a 2-iron and do anything with it, but they decide that's how they're going to do it. So Moses takes the first shot. He rears back as hard as he can, and he swings with all his might, and the ball goes up in the air, and there's a water hazard in front of the green. The ball drops, splash, in the middle of the water hazard. Moses walks to the water hazard, parts the water, walks in, chips up on the green, he's down in 3. Well, next is Jesus. Jesus rears back with all his might, he hits the ball, it goes up, and it's a longer shot than Moses, but still it splash into the water hazard. Jesus walks out on the water, calls the ball up, chips on, he's down in 3, which I would have made him take a penalty. And then the old man swings. Great shot, but it starts rising and it starts falling toward the water. Right before it hits the water, a fish jumps up out of the water, catches it in his mouth, and before the fish can get back down into the water, an eagle grabs the fish and starts flying away. But the fish is flopping so much that it falls on the green, the ball falls out of his mouth, it goes in the hole for a hole-in-one. And Jesus turns and looks at the old man and said, "Great shot, Dad." God's our Father. Isn't it great to know that we have a Father who is in control of everything? You know, if we're searching for who we are spiritually, the things that feed our souls, it's very important to know who our Father is. Who is God? You know, the Pharisees came to Jesus and they were talking about law, and they wanted to know what was the most important thing. And you know, really in our life, we want to know what the bottom line is, don't we? What's most important? And so we read in Mark chapter 12, in verses 29 and 30, it says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and with your strength." He's saying the most important thing that you can do is to know God. The problem is we live in a culture and live in a society that have a lot of weird views about who God is. Some see Him as distant. Some see Him as uninvolved. Some see Him as this hateful vengeance God. And that's not who God is at all. God is righteous. He is holy. And He is loving. You know, we see in our nation a variety of different groups who have unusual and flawed views of who God is, whether it's through Islam or Buddhism or some of those Hinduism. But what they have is a faulty and incorrect and an incomplete perception of God as a Father. As a matter of fact, when we don't have a clear understanding of God as a Father, our personal theology will always be flawed. If we don't really understand God and what it means for Him to be a Father, then our personal theology, which theology, by the way, is a study or a belief about God, our personal beliefs about who God is will always be flawed. You know, when we're young, we think of God kind of like a Santa. And it's like, we ask God for something and we get it. That's kind of the way it works. And in spiritual immaturity or immaturity age-wise, that might be how you understand God. That might be the beginning of your understanding of God. You ask and you get. But we also realize as we go through our lives, that's not really how things work. And we find out that sometimes we ask and we don't get. Sometimes we ask and it's delayed. There's a lot of different circumstances that go around our relationship in that way with God. And so we get to a point where we have to decide who God is. He's got to be one of two things. Either we're going to believe that God is a loving Father, or we're going to believe that God is a list of rules. I'm going to say it again. We're either going to get to a point as we mature as people that we're going to see God as a loving Father, or we're going to see God as a list of rules. And the problem is when rules become a substitute for God, life becomes incredibly dreadful. When we see God as a list of do's and don'ts rather than a list of wills and thou shalt, our life becomes drudgery. Jesus is with his disciples and he is sitting and he's talking about who God is, and they want to know something. How can we talk to God? And they come to Jesus and say, Lord, teach us how to pray. And in Matthew 6, he teaches them to pray this way. I'm just going to give verse 9. It says, pray then in this way, Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Look at that. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Well, I want to talk to God. How can you talk to God? We can address him a lot of different ways. Jesus could have said anything he wanted to. He says, if you want to speak to God, speak to him as you would a father. In this particular case, he uses the word Abba, which is really not even father. It's the word that we would call dad. Dad, you're in heaven. I honor your name. Well, in our culture, fatherhood is a difficult concept. Truth is not everybody had a great father. And when we start talking about God the Father, I can remember a time where I preached about how God was like great fathers, and I started talking about how great fathers are, and after the service was over, a guy who I had known but didn't know this part of his life walked up to me at the back door and he said, God's nothing like my father. My father left my mother with a delivery room nurse the day that my brother was born. And I didn't see him until a few years ago when he wanted to come and bask in who I've become as a man. Some people have fathers who are distant. Some people have fathers who are in the house but they're not attached. Some people have fathers who never show up. And so the reality in our culture is that sometimes when we start talking about God as a father, we struggle with what that really means. And usually the doctrine of grace becomes garbled because of the message of fatherhood in our culture. And we start talking about grace and the Father. A lot of times we think that grace means no rules. I call it the Outback version of grace. No rules, just right. Or maybe it's the Burger King view of grace. You can tell I'm on a diet. I have all these food places. Have it your way. We go back to immaturity, seeing him as a Santa. And the truth is we need to understand who God is, even when it comes to his expectations of our life. But God is a father. And so you say, well, if God's a father, why are there so many rules? Why wouldn't he have no expectations? Well, does your father have no expectations of you? So if you want to understand God's demands for how we live our life, in light of who a father is, let's talk about that for just a minute. Why are there so many rules? I don't know how many of you have heard of Sigmund Freud. He was a psychoanalyst that did a lot of studies. And he said something that was interesting in one of his books. And it says, whoops, I went too far. Psychoanalysis, it daily demonstrates how youthful persons lose their religious beliefs as soon as the authority of the father breaks down. I want you to look at that real closely. This is a guy that had a messed up view of family, a messed up view of a lot of things, but he also said when it comes to religious belief, when it comes to spiritual journey, we finally see that there's a demonstration that as the authority of the Father breaks down in a culture and even in a home, religious beliefs become back burner issues. If you're in a home where the father is disrespected, and you grow up and the father is trying to be a godly man, but the wife and the kids disrespect him, don't be surprised if your kids are not really interested in your spiritual journey. Because when the authority of the father is broken down, understanding God as a father is nearly impossible. I'm an imperfect father. But I can tell you that the greatest blessing in my life is being a dad. The greatest blessing that I've ever had is being Olivia and Sawyer's dad. As a matter of fact, my son, though, he's a student at Lipscomb, and the last thing he wants is anyone to know he's a preacher's kid. And so when people ask him, "Aren't you Joy Davis's son?" his answer is, "No." Don't know the guy, and then finally he'll fess up, "Yeah, he's my dad." You know, I had rules for my kids. Y'all got rules for your kids? And I did it because I'm a loving father. Now, there's one set of rules I wish I had. And I started thinking about this, when I started thinking, well, if I had rules, what are my rules for my kids? And some of them were like, don't cross the street without holding my hand when you were little. And I remember how bad it was when they stopped. But my daughter is 25, and she's been dating since she was 16. And here's a list of rules I wish I had written back then. And this is rules for dating my daughter. And any of you dads are welcome to get a copy of this. Number 1, if you pull into my driveway and honk, you better be delivering a pizza. Because you're not leaving with my daughter. 2, do not touch my daughter in front of me. You may glance at her as long as you do not peer below her neck. If you cannot keep your hands and your eyes off my daughter, I will gleefully remove them. 3, understand that she will always make you late for dinner, movies, etc. She is worth the wait. If punctuality is important to you, do not date my daughter. If you do want to date her, instead of waiting and fidgeting impatiently, paint my house or change the oil in my VW. 4, the following places are not appropriate for a date. Places with a sofa or any furniture that is more comfortable than a wooden stool. Places where there are no parents, policemen, or nuns within eyesight. Places where there is darkness. Places where there is dancing, holding hands, or happiness of any kind. Places where the temperature is warm enough to induce my daughter to wear anything more revealing than a prisoner-style jumpsuit or a goose-down parka. Movies with strong romantic themes are to be avoided at all costs. 5, I have no doubt that you're a popular dude with many opportunities to date other girls. Dating them is fine with me as long as it's okay with her. Otherwise, once you've gone out with my little girl, you will continue to date her and only her until she is done with you. And 5, if you make her cry, I will make you cry more. Those are my rules. Rules are important. They're important in relationships. In Deuteronomy 5:3, as God is explaining him as a father and what rules work, he says, you shall walk in the ways of which your Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you will possess. There's one version of this that says that you will follow the commandments of God so that you will live long and prosper. Really? What's he saying? He's saying these rules are important. They're not important just to follow. They're important because they mean something to your life. The first rules, when God starts writing rules for community with him, we know, and he starts Moses goes up to the top of the mountain and he gives him these 10 commandments. In Exodus 20, verses 1 through 3, he starts with this commandment. God spoke these words saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no gods before me. Now, the first 4 commandments are all about love God. The last 6 commandments are about how to live in community. But when I start thinking about that verse of Scripture and start thinking of God as a dad, I start thinking about my relationship with my children. You know what? If I had a first rule for my kids, you are to have no dads before me. That as your dad, I'm an authority in your life, and you should hear what I have to say. Do not be distracted by somebody else. Don't come to me and say, well, my teacher said blah, 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 blah. Is your teacher your dad? No, he's not. You will have no dads before me. Dostoevsky, the philosopher, said this: where there is no God, all is permitted. So why rules? They're an evidence that there's a God who wants to be in community with us. You see, if there weren't any rules, a couple of things would happen. We're talking about rules right now. If there weren't any rules, a couple of things would happen. Number one, society would absolutely be impaired. Think about it. If there are no rules, guess what? It's okay to murder somebody. If there are no rules, it's okay to steal things. If there are no rules, it's okay to assault other people. If there are no rules, you can do whatever you want to do. But what happens is that where there are no rules, there is utter chaos. God gives us those rules because he says, I want you to have a society that actually works. We have attorneys in the room, and they'll tell you there are over 35 million laws in the United States. That seems like a lot, doesn't it? I don't even know what they are. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a game and I don't know what the rules are. There are over 35 million laws in the United States. All of them are based on the last 6 laws of the 10 Commandments. They all go back to God saying, this is how you live in community. And if you don't live this way, society as a whole becomes impaired. And the second thing that happens when there are no rules is that creation becomes endangered. Follow me on this one. Our knowledge is finite. I mean, think about this. We like to think we know everything that we're supposed to know, but we don't know everything we're supposed to know. And there's so much that we don't know. But God does know everything. And sometimes he creates laws for our good. You go in Scripture and you look at some of the things that we read as laws in Scripture. You go to the New Testament, Jesus tells you that the laws that are important are you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else kind of falls under that. Well, what about when I go to the Old Testament and I find this law where you're not supposed to wear clothes that are made of 2 different kinds of thread? Well, that was a law that was intended for that group of people at that specific time, and it was intended to tell them that there was only one God. There was a purpose behind that law. But that doesn't mean you go home and throw away all your polyester blend. Well, what about if I have a clay pot in my house and there's a crack in it? You know, Leviticus tells us that we have clay pots and they're cracked, that we're to take them outside the village and we're to bury them, destroy them and bury them in the ground. Am I supposed to do? Well, no, it might be a good idea. The reason God told the Israelites to do that is because we found out later in 1845 there was something called bacteria and germs. And if you have a pot that you cook in that's got a crack in it, bacteria and germs can set up in there and it cause sickness and death. It was a law that was, because they didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about germs, it was there to protect them, protect creation. You know, there in Deuteronomy, you can read chapter 23, it talks about what do you do with human waste? I know we don't want to talk about poo in church, but what do you do with human waste? Well, you take it outside the village, you dig a hole and you bury that human waste. They did it. They didn't know why they did it. They were told that that was a law. That's something they had to do because it was to protect creation. You know, later on we found during the Black Plague that it all started because they didn't improperly dispose of human waste. God knew what they didn't know. Now, when it comes with how we live our lives and God being an authority in our life, and he says, you're to live your life this way and we want to live our life this way, And we have the humility to say, okay, God must be right and I must be wrong. I need to change. Why? Sometimes we have to change simply because we know that God knows what we don't know. And part of being that a child of the Father, being a child of God means trusting that our Father knows what's going on even when we don't. That's part of understanding this father-child relationship, that God is our Father. In the 103rd Psalm, in verse 13, it says, just as the Father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. And I love this verse because this is the transition in our sermon. We've talked about that God is our Father, but there are things that he expects from our lives. There is a new law. We love him and we love people. And we do what's in the best interest of the people who are around us. But why? Why did he have these rules? Why does he want us to live to this standard? Why is that important? It's not just to preserve society. And it's not just so that creation won't be damaged. It's more than that. God has these expectations in our life because he loves us. He wants to be in community with us. You see, the 103rd Psalm tells us that he has compassion on people that fear him. He's emotionally invested in you. He thinks about you, and you were on his mind long before you were a twinkle in your father's eye. God is emotionally invested in who you are as his child. And rules without relationship creates emptiness and abandonment. Rules without relationship will cause us to do the bare minimum to obey a rule rather than to love the spirit of the law. With relationship, rules become a function of trust. Matthew chapter 7, verse 11. I want to read this, and I'm going to tell you a little story. It says, if you then, being evil, and this talks about the character of God, if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? God loves us. He has a standard for our life, but he loves us, and he wants to bless us. Several years ago, Olivia was little, and I don't know if she's here to hear this story, but she'll remember it. She was sick, and it was a time my wife was working in the evenings, working for the post office, and so I was at home, and I was not babysitting, I was parenting. But I was at home, and she was throwing up, and she was downstairs on the couch wanting to watch TV, and so I go and I get a garbage can for her to put in front of her just in case she gets sick again. And I go and get the garbage can, and I bring it back, and she looks at me and she says, "Mommy won't let us use that garbage can. It's a good garbage can." I say, I'm faced with a choice here. First off, I didn't know that Mommy had a throw-up garbage can. That was foreign to me. But it's like, I can either go and find an acceptable can, or I can do what I did. I looked at her and I said, "Oh, sweetie, nothing's too good for my little girl. I'm a good father, and I love my kids, and I act in what's the best interest of my children. But rules have to come with a relationship." And this next verse of Scripture I want to talk about is probably one of the most important verses in this sermon this morning. I want you to look at it, but you won't be able to find it probably right off the bat, because if you threw your Bible on the floor, it wouldn't fall right open to the prophet Zephaniah. But in Zephaniah 3, in verse 17, we find this part of God's character. I used on the board is the World English Bible because I think it's a great translation of this verse. It says, "Yahweh your God is among you." He wants to be in community with you. He's a mighty one who will save. He wants to save us. He wants to be in community with us. And then look how he feels about you. He will rejoice over you with joy. You have a God that when he thinks about you, his heart is filled with joy, and he rejoices that you're his child. He'll calm you with his love. A father who in a spiritual way says, "Please come climb up in my lap because I'm your dad." And I love this last part. He will rejoice over you with singing. Any of you dads sing to your kids? I sing to mine, or used to, before they told me I couldn't sing. When my daughter was little, we used to sing songs to her, and one of the songs I would sing was Van Morrison's Have I Told You Lately That I Love You? And yeah, I can sing as good as Van Morrison. And when I think about that, my daughter remembers me singing to her. And it's special. Do you realize that you have a dad that when he thinks of you, he's happy? You have a dad that when you're going through trouble wants you in his lap, taking comfort. You have a dad that rejoices over you with singing. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus uses the word Abba, which I talked about earlier. It means daddy. But it's really deeper than that. Because the relationship that's implied in this Lord's Prayer is one that says, you're chosen. You're my kid not by chance, but by choice. Galatians 4, Paul writes it this way in verse 4 and 5, and then in verse 7 it says, but when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. In verse 7 it goes on to say this, therefore we're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, we're an heir through God. We're God's adopted children. We're those children that under the old law you couldn't disinherit an adopted child. We're an heir and will always be an heir. We're special to God because he's our dad. But when we start thinking about who God is, he chose us. He adopted us and he gave us the greatest honor of all time. 1 John 3:1 tells us this. See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God. And to reiterate it, he says, and that's what we are. And such we're children of God. The greatest honor is that God calls us by his name, not our own. That God sees us through the blood of his Son as pure and holy and precious and important because he's our dad. And he loves us more than we can ever imagine. I want to show you an iconic photo. Some of you may remember this. This is John Kennedy and his little son, John. Both of them have passed away. John Kennedy was the president of the United States when I was born. And actually, a little after I was born. But John Kennedy was a president that in his short tenure was faced with some amazing challenges. Threats from the Soviet Union, the Bay of Pigs crisis. He sat behind that very desk, there's a picture, and basically he was a world leader. He did amazing things, and he did them with a little boy sitting under the desk. There's picture after picture of him being in the Oval Office and John peeking out from under this huge mahogany desk. And I want you to understand that that's who your God is too. That our God is a Father who controls the universe while he lets us play at his feet. That we have a daddy who's in control of everything, who has strength, who has wisdom, who has all this, and he controls the whole universe. And he allows us to be at his feet. See, everything about being a Christian is summed up in that first phrase of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who's in heaven. Our Father who controls the universe. Hallowed be your name because you allow us to be your children. The Christian writer J.I. Packer, in one of his books, wrote this. He says, if you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out how much he thinks of the thought of being God's child and having God as a father. If this is not the thought that prompts and controls his worship and prayers as well as his whole outlook on life, it means that he does not understand Christianity very well. In John 1:12 and 13, John writes these words, as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. We become His children not because of chance, not because of biology. We're His children because He has chosen those who will receive Him. You see, we have a Father who says, I want to be in community with you. I want you to be my child. We have a story in front of us that begins with one man in a garden and ends with a multitude in a city. And the beauty of that story of the multitude in the city is the first thing He wants you to know about Him in Revelation 21 is that He wants you to know that God will be among them. He'll be their God and they'll be His people. You see, the first step toward reclaiming community with us is that God encourages us to see Him as Dad. The question is, can you see Him that way? Do you see God as your dad? Do you accept Him as your dad? And you know, I want to invite you to accept this Creator, the one who put everything in place. I want you to see Him as a Father who loves you, who rejoices when He thinks of you, who encourages you to come to Him with your pain and your brokenness, and who sings over you because of His love for you. Because unless we start to understand that, we'll never understand all the other layers of who God is and what He means in our lives.